You really can't make an argument for anybody in tier one but Ja'Marr Chase. He really stands alone at this point. You're looking at Chase with the past 2 weeks sitting at 80 fantasy points. Ja'Marr Chase has more weeks with over 40 points in fantasy football than under 10. The man is insane. This is the best passing offense in the NFL. Higgins is definitely rising up these ranks as well. Going over to tier two, we are going to have Jefferson, Nico Collins, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and A.J. Brown. The reason you can't have Jefferson in tier one is obviously the Minnesota Vikings offense is just not comparable to what you have with Cincinnati. The reason we can't have Nico Collins in tier one is we haven't seen the dude since week 5. Hopefully he cements himself as a tier one option after tonight's game. The reason we can't have Amon-Ra St. Brown tier one is here this Lions offense, while it is arguably the best offense in the NFL, it's ultimately going to be a rush first offense. So maybe it's difficult to assume that you just consistently see double-digit targets here for St. Brown. Obviously, blow-up game against the Jacksonville Jaguars, but fundamentally, you are looking at a receiver that's had 2 games with double-digit targets this season. And then with A.J. Brown, we actually have only seen a total of 2 games with over 20 fantasy points. Now, obviously, you missed the stretch of games at the beginning of the season with the hamstring, but still the target volume hasn't been there. Since the bye week, you have not had a single game with double-digit targets. Now, going over to our next tier, we are going to be looking at Drake London. With London, obviously, this was a horrendous performance from the Atlanta Falcons offense. But if you looked at sportsbooks, they were actually telling you to expect that. It was a really tough matchup going up against Denver where the offense just imploded. Do I think that this is a massive concern that we have for the Atlanta Falcons through the rest of the season? Probably not. I mean, we saw them also implode back in week 1 against the Steelers and what was a very tough matchup there. Malik Neighbors is a receiver that is at the very top of the NFL in targets per game. I mean, the man is still averaging over 12 targets per contest. Now, with that being said, obviously, it is a very bad offense. We do not have word if Daniel Jones will be the starter or not yet after the bye. Looking at Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, both are locked and loaded, top 10 options every single week. Hard to get away from it. I mean, if you're looking at what we saw this week, you actually had Kupp with the majority of targets. Hell, it was 10-9. In reality, these are the only 2 players touching the ball in Los Angeles outside of Kyren Williams. It is the most concentrated offense in the NFL. Stafford is playing phenomenal ball at the moment. So again, it's been a very rare thing through history to have 2 wide receivers consistently inside the top 10. I mean, obviously, you can go back to like 2019 with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, but this is very reminiscent of that, minus the Jameis Winston interceptions. And then looking at Tyreek Hill, wide receiver 10, I know a lot of people hated us for putting him wide receiver 10 last week. I don't think really anything changes. I want to stand by. If we look at the games that Tua's played with Tyreek, you've had 26 points, 12 points, 11.5 points, and 19 points. So every single game Tyreek's played with Tua in full, you've had double-digit fantasy points. Now, obviously, has it been a top 3 option so far? No, Tyreek's been very bad. Tyreek's not who you drafted him to be in the middle of round 1 or at the very beginning of round 1. But I still do think that he's a must-start option every single week. He's through his bye as well, so you have an extra week in comparison to a lot of these other players. Mike Evans will be our next wide receiver. I think you could actually make an argument to move Mike Evans up even further from this point when we get a confirmation that he's good to go in week 12. But if you go through and you look at the last time we had Evans, it was week 7. He suffers the hamstring. They opt not to put him on the IR. He misses weeks 8, 9, 10. You had the bye week, week 11. You would have assumed that if this hamstring injury was that serious, they would have thrown him on the IR with the expectations for him to miss week 12 as well, to be eligible to return in week 13. They decided not to do it, so I am holding out the outside hope that we do see Mike Evans this week. And keep in mind, you have no Chris Godwin here either, so no Godwin, Evans back in should be a phenomenal spot. And then with Garrett Wilson, yes, I want to reiterate, he is behind Tyreek Hill for us in our rest of season rankings. You can yell at me in the comment section that Garrett Wilson scored more points this year. I understand. Yes, Garrett Wilson is the wide receiver 3 in total fantasy points scored this season. But a lot of these games were when you had no Devonte Adams. Since Adams has come in, you've actually seen the targets for Wilson fall in this offense. Adams came in back in week 7, and there on, you had 9, 8, 10, 6, and 8 targets. So Wilson's down to 8, 9 targets a game effectively with Devonte Adams. Whereas if you're looking at pre-Devonte Adams, Garrett Wilson was up there averaging about 11 to 12 targets per contest. And also, it's just a much worse offense than what we have with some of these other players. Now, leading off our next tier, we're going to have DK Metcalf. Metcalf had a fine day against the Niners. Now, obviously, it's extremely difficult to go through and know exactly what to expect here rest of season with Jackson Smith and Jigba really coming on strongly. JSN outproducing Metcalf in every major statistical category this past week. I still stand by the large sample that you've had from Metcalf, not only earlier this season, but at the same time through his entire NFL career. Whereas with JSN, we've had a couple of very strong weeks, but obviously JSN's trending in the right direction. And honestly, he's taking a little more from Lockett than he is Metcalf. It's like Lockett's been completely phased out here in Seattle. Marvin Harrison will be our next option. With Marvin Harrison Jr., the last time you had double-digit targets was back in week 3. I mean, haven't seen a game with 8 or more targets since week 3. So obviously we've had some of these very impressive performances like the Miami game, the Jets game, where he gets there with the efficiency. It looks to be a good offense. The issue is the volume's not going to be there for him to be a very consistent option, even in a full PPR format. Then looking at CeeDee Lamb, obviously this is a ranking that we are having to submit before we get the game on Monday night. Expectations are CeeDee Lamb continues to dominate volume in what appears to be one of the worst offenses in the league. You look at over the past 4 weeks before the Monday night game, you have CeeDee Lamb with 14, 17, 12, and 10 targets. The expectations for Monday night, you actually have Lamb higher, lower 60.5 receiving yards over there on Underdog Fantasy. So if you think that Lamb's completely toast and he has absolutely no shot to do anything going into the future, by all means, go take the lower than 60.5 receiving yards. You do you. I'll leave the link in the comment section and the description. If you use promo code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you're going to be getting a free CJ Stroud pick for tonight's game, more than less than half a total yard, and a free team review that we are doing in the live stream every single night. And the Devonte Adams will be our next receiver here. If you're looking at Adams, since he's come into this offense, he's actually right there with Garrett Wilson if you are looking at targets per game. Obviously, we are going to assume that Wilson, the young ascending receiver, is going to outproduce the 31-year-old who is on the way out, who has been very inefficient. But you could have some positive touchdown regression coming for Devonte Adams realistically very soon, where the man's sitting with like 50 targets in New York and he's only had 1 touchdown. That's probably going to swing in the other direction. Now, going over to our next option, George Pickens, you can make a very strong argument, should be higher in these rankings. Obviously, this is an instant reaction. I'm recording this right after the Cincinnati Bengals game ended on Sunday night. And honestly, I think as you check the rankings on the site as the week goes on, I could very easily see myself sliding George Pickens up all the way up, potentially to 13. Because if you look at what we have seen since Russell Wilson has taken over, I mean, you have 22, 11, 20, and 17 fantasy points here in Pittsburgh. The Steelers look great. The offense looks great. And it's not like he's just getting there off receiving touchdowns. You've actually seen the receiving yardage be there as well, where the man is averaging about 90 receiving yards per contest with Russell Wilson under center. So honestly, as we look at this, Pickens is probably too low. I think you can make an argument that T. Higgins is too low as well. Obviously, with Higgins, you always have the injury concerns. I mean, there was a point in this Chargers game where I thought Higgins was down and out. I thought Higgins was about to be missing another month. But I mean, in the games that Higgins has actually played so far this season, we've seen 7, 12, 29, 14, 18, and about 30 fantasy points this past week against the Chargers. This is a receiver that sees a considerable amount of volume when healthy, hovering around 9, 10 targets a game, and what projects out to be the best passing offense in the NFL. And also, you don't have Burrow spreading it out as much as what we saw earlier in the season in terms of the target share that we are seeing the tight ends accumulate here in Cincinnati. So Higgins looks great. I'm super excited about him. And honestly, again, a lot of these mid wide receiver twos, they're all about the same. So I think you can rearrange just whatever order you want. Terry McLaurin had a disgusting performance in a really tough matchup against the Eagles. Obviously, they have been consistently shutting down opposing wide receiver ones. It was a Thursday night game as well. And with Terry, if you take a step backwards and look at what we have seen from weeks 3 through 10, Terry McLaurin is a receiver that had a low performance of 13 fantasy points. So outside of weeks 1, 2, and now week 11, Terry McLaurin has given you an incredibly high floor through the course of the entire season. Now, of course, you can call him 2-point Terry for his performance against Philly, but keep in mind, I was playing him in the Flock League or against him in the Flock League, and you know yours truly, if you've been watching the Flock League, is a master defensive coordinator. Now, going over to what we have with our next option, we're going to be looking at Jackson Smith-Njigba. JSN, back-to-back weeks here, double-digit targets. I mean, 2 weeks ago, the absolute blow-up against the Los Angeles Rams with 37 fantasy points, 180 receiving yards, multiple receiving touchdowns. Expectations, of course, was that this volume was going to be coming down with DK Metcalf back in this offense. It's not exactly what you see happen here with DK Metcalf back in. JSN still has 11 targets. You still get the 22 fantasy points against the Niners. 100% he is trending up in these rankings. You go back to where he was, a week ago, we are viewing him more so as flex consideration every week. And I would consider here the top 5 tiers or so, at least where this tier is with JSN, that these are the must-start wide receivers every single week at wide receiver 2. I'm looking at Jayden Reed as our next option. I know a lot of people want to scream at us saying that we have Jayden Reed too low every week. My thing is, this guy keeps getting lucky. I'm sorry to say it. This is going to come back to bite him. This week, you get the touchdown. The week prior, you get the 113 receiving yards off 5 receptions. The volume is simply not there for Jayden Reed. I don't see how he is this efficient time in and time out. If you're looking at fantasy points per route run, if you're looking at fantasy points per target, this dude has to be number 1 in the NFL among wide receivers. You have one game with more than 6 targets this season. One game. This is an offense that spreads it around to so many different options. Of course, it's a phenomenal passing offense with Jordan Love under center. But I don't know. Honestly, if I knew you weren't going to bully me for it, I'd probably just put Deebo Samuel ahead of Jayden Reed. But Deebo, dear God, at some point we have to move this dude down the rankings. We have to wave the white flag. You'd assume, or at least I assumed, once Ayuk went down, Deebo Samuel was in line to just absolutely crush and turn into a league winner. However, you're looking at the last 3 games played. You're at 7, 6, and 7 targets. We haven't cracked, more than 15 fantasy points since week 6 this season. He's been wildly inconsistent. It's still a very good offense, and he's still going to be playing pretty much every snap, running pretty much every route. But dear God, at some point, we got to move the guy down. And then looking at Zay Flowers, I'm sorry, but this dude also gets lucky this week. I'm just going to say it. Zay Flowers also, I put in the range of Jayden Reed, where I know we keep on getting screamed that he's too low in our rankings. And I'm sorry to say, he keeps getting lucky. You almost had absolutely nothing from Zay Flowers this week until you get the touchdown at the very end of the game. You have a total of 2 receptions. The one thing that we are completely wrong about with this Baltimore Ravens offense is I did think that Deontay Johnson was going to come in and be relevant in terms of taking targets away from Andrews and Flowers. But it's not like Flowers is disappointed because of Deontay Johnson. Deontay is essentially a 0 in this offense. Now going down to our next tier, we are going to be led off with DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins has had 2 really tough matchups here against Denver and Buffalo. You don't really see the passing volume go in the direction of DeAndre Hopkins. You're hoping that in better matchups for the Chiefs going into the future, that maybe Hopkins is a little more viable, but you actually have the snaps taking a tick down this past week. And the main concern that you have with that is that JuJu SmithSchuster was back in. So JuJu being back in, if that means Hopkins is going to be playing 70+% of the snaps here in KC, it's definitely going to knock him in fantasy. But I don't want to overreact too much here, just because going up against Denver and Buffalo is a super tough spot here for the Chiefs. Our next option will be Jauan Jennings. Jennings is flying up, and honestly, he may continue to rise. I mean, looking at Jennings back-to-back weeks here with 11 targets, obviously 25 points, a phenomenal performance. My only hesitation here with Jauan is I do think that when we get Kittle back in week 12, you actually see some of these targets get dispersed over to George Kittle. And also, based off looking at the very large sample, not just what we've had over the past 2 weeks, again, I still expect that Deebo Samuel's going to have a decent little role here in this offense, which I do think that you will get some regression from Jauan Jennings in comparison to him. I mean, averaging over 20 points per game over the past 2 weeks, but still looks phenomenal. Devonta Smith, we've been talking about it, and it sucks, but we got to also move him down. I have him in the flock league. The issue here is since the bye week, obviously, one, the Eagles are just running the piss out of the ball. And two, you have not had a single game with 8 or more targets. The first 3 weeks this season, you have 8, 10 targets, and Devonta Smith looks like a super consistent option. After the bye week, he begins to get there based off receiving touchdowns, but the volume isn't exactly there. And now that the touchdowns go, Devonta Smith's just kind of sitting here holding nothing. I mean, since the bye, 4, 2, 7, 6, 3, 6 targets. So he is really a touchdown or bust, a boom bust option at this point, which freaking sucks. I have this dude. And honestly, if I didn't have him on my team, I think we can make an argument that Courtland Sutton should be ahead of him at this point. I mean, since Sutton dropped the goose egg against the New Orleans Saints, Sutton has come through and he's averaging 9 to 10 targets a contest. Sutton's averaging over 15 fantasy points per game. And Sutton's the wide receiver 16 this season in total fantasy points scored. But the most encouraging thing about Courtland Sutton is the fact that Bo Nix looks so much better than he did at the beginning of the season. And every week that goes by, Bo Nix is looking better and better and better. Our next option will be Ladd McConkey. With Ladd, we actually get a career high 9 targets. You get a career high 123 receiving yards in this game against the Bengals. Obviously, it was the perfect game environment in which the Chargers were actually forced to throw the ball and they were forced to just kind of get into that shootout with Cincinnati. With Ladd McConkey, super excited about what the future is here. I do want to reiterate, though, it is going to be a rush-first offense that can play phenomenal defense, that can win a lot of football games, that may not be looking to throw the ball with volume in the second half. Our next option will be Brian Thomas Jr. I honestly think you could have him even lower in these rankings if you told me, Mason, for 100% certainty, Trevor Lawrence is out for the rest of the season. If you told me that, then sure, by all means, move Thomas down even lower because it's just the worst offense you could ever imagine. Now, the issue with that is we don't know if Lawrence is out for the rest of the season yet. And also, you have Kirk injured. You have Gabe Davis injured now as well. So Brian Thomas Jr. is kind of the last guy left standing. Josh Downs comes through with yet again another super impressive week. Like, Downs has been such a great draft pick, specifically in underdog drafts where like you took Downs as a wide receiver 5, there he's a wide receiver 2, and that's just a massive, massive difference. Obviously, in your regular redraft league, you picked up Downs off the waiver wire. If you play in a 2 wide receiver 1 flex 10-team league, it's not like Downs moves the needle too much. But I mean, just from a process perspective, I want to applaud everybody who was drafting Josh Downs, who is touting Josh Downs this year. The man's been incredible. This week, you get away with 19.5 fantasy points. Obviously, Anthony Richardson has a great day himself, but AR actually has 2 rushing touchdowns, which nothing there helps Downs. If you do look at the majority of targets going to Michael Pittman Jr. and the expectations that we probably get some regression here with Anthony Richardson, I don't know if we can call Downs a must-start option just yet because I don't know if we can consistently rely upon Anthony Richardson just yet. Now, going over to Amari Cooper, I mean, I got to throw in the towel, right? I mean, we were saying to buy low, I think 2 weeks ago, thinking, oh, okay, when he comes back in, he's the wide receiver 1 in Buffalo, attached to Josh Allen. That's super appealing. The dude finally comes back. We see 3 targets, 2 receptions, 55 receiving yards. And the thing is, I think you could still make an argument that potentially he's wide receiver 1 here coming out of the bye week when he's 100% healthy from the wrist. But also coming out of the bye week, Keon Coleman may be healthy. Dalton Kincaid may be healthy. So at that point, it may just be a super dispersed target tree where obviously Shakir has been dominant. Shakir's been significantly better than any other Buffalo receiver so far this season, including Amari Cooper. Darnell Mooney will be our next option. With Darnell Mooney, it's just impossible to rank him right now. I'm sitting here knowing that he's a hamstring injury. I don't know if he's going to be missing any time. It is the perfect bye week in week 12 for Mooney to hopefully get right and only miss a week that he was going to miss regardless. But obviously, we're going to have to wait for updates. Calvin Ridley will be the next play. With Ridley, very similar issue that you have with Brian Thomas Jr. A wide receiver that should have all the volume in his offense, but it's a garbage offense. And for me, I view Thomas as like a more talented receiver than Ridley at this point. Shakir has been great. I mean, Shakir, 12 targets this past week. You knew he was a must-start option. But again, I do want to reiterate, you look at how it's been for Shakir over the past 2 weeks now, where Shakir's had about 12 fantasy points, then 15 fantasy points. I mean, he's been a super consistent option with just anywhere from 10 to 20 fantasy points. What's hilarious is if you actually look at this for Shakir, he's had 0 games with more than 20 fantasy points, and he has had 1 game with fewer than 10. The man is right there giving you wide receiver 3 performance after wide receiver 3 performance after wide receiver 3 performance. But once you get Amari at 100% health coming out of the bye, Keon Coleman potentially healthy coming out of the bye, Dalton Kincaid potentially healthy coming out of the bye, these 12 targets are no longer going to be with Shakir, right? Like Shakir sets a career high in targets, but also everybody in Buffalo is currently injured. So I want to give Shakir his props. He's been great. But again, I do think that this situation changes a bit as you get these healthier options in. Looking at Jacoby Myers, he should have all the volume in a very bad offense. Looking at Cedric Tillman, I know a lot of people wanted to scream at us that we had Cedric Tillman way too low last week. You can scream at me again that we have Cedric Tillman way too low this week. I'll just reiterate, you go look at the targets in this offense. Jerry Jeudy gets just as many targets. Elijah Moore gets just as many targets. It's dispersed between these 3 receivers. They're all going to have their respective spike weeks. We've had more from Cedric Tillman than we've had from anybody else. So if I had to make a bet on which receiver was the wide receiver 1 in this offense, it's going to be Cedric Tillman. You can go in the comment section and scream at me how I'm too low on him, but you do you. DJ Moore will be our next play. With DJ Moore, I know that, yes, he finally scores double-digit fantasy points, first time since week 5. And maybe the change with the offensive coordinator here does help Caleb. Caleb looked a lot better this past week. But my thing is, Rome Odunze is now kind of setting up to lead this team in targets. Keenan Allen's still seeing a ton of targets. And it's very similar to what you have in like Cleveland, where there are a bunch of wide receivers that are taking volume away from each other. But the difference is I don't have any faith in the passing volume in Chicago in comparison to what I would have with Winston. Chris Olave will throw here at 38. Full transparency, Olave may not come back this season, right? But if he does come back, you're in an offense with no Shaheed, and really, you're just going to see every single target. Now, going down to our next tier, we're going to look at Tank Dell as an option that I want nothing to do with now that Nico Collins is coming back. Of course, since we're putting this video out before the Monday night game, expect Tank Dell to drop 30 to 40 points. Jameson Williams will be our next option. With Jameson, I do want to reiterate, when the long touchdown's there, he's going to be great. When the long touchdown's not there, he's not going to be much. Boom bust option, stretching NFL defenses, creating a lot of value for this Detroit Lions offense, and that he can create space underneath for Amon-Ra St. Brown, create space underneath for these running backs, which is exactly what they need. And obviously, when Jared Goff throws the ball for 400 passing yards and has 4 touchdowns, Jameson will get there. Jordan Addison will be our next play. I took Addison in a ridiculous amount of underdog drafts. I would love to go, oh, look at the touchdown. Jordan Addison scores. Maybe it helps an underdog team of mine, but in reality, I don't see I can start Addison anytime soon. Xavier Worthy scores a touchdown. I don't see I can start Xavier Worthy anytime soon. It's not like the roles dramatically changed. Rome Odunze does see 10 targets. And honestly, Rome probably should be higher in these rankings. I'm going to update the rankings on the site. I think Rome should be up in the same tier as Darnell Mooney. Rome looks like he is trending towards having a very real shot to be the wide receiver 1 down the stretch here in Chicago. Again, the issue is this is a horrendous offense. And then honestly, Jalen Waddle should be lower than this. I just wanted to include Jalen Waddle so we could all be on the same page. Yes, I think we had him ranked at like wide receiver 33, 34 last week. Whatever the hell it was way too high. This guy's done arguably the worst pick in fantasy football drafts this year, where the last time you get double-digit points was back in week 1. And even with Tua under center, he has been horrendous. And JuJu Smith, yes, JuJu Smith is better. But I think that's all I got for you. I really appreciate you and really hope that I was able to help you out in some way with this. Again, if you wanted to go check out any of the receivers for the games tonight, you have CeeDee Lamb, higher, lower, 60.5 receiving yards. And you have Nico Collins, higher, lower, 72.5 receiving yards on Underdog Fantasy. I'll leave the link in the description and comment section. Promo code FLOCK, you will get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, at the same time, you're going to be getting a free team review in the live stream that we're doing every single night. And you're going to be getting a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Just make sure you go through the link in the description or comment section. But thank you again. Really appreciate you. And really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later today.